Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today for an important discussion about seeking and serving the truth in an age that's challenged by disinformation and misinformation. My name is Sarah Spiker. I am Deputy General Secretary of the World Association for Christian Communication, which is an organization that researches, educates, and promotes communication as a human right. I also have long worked in the World Council of Churches, a fellowship of over 350 churches worldwide, which provides a unique space to reflect, to speak, pray, and act together. WCC and WACC have joined together for this first webinar on disinformation and misinformation and what we can do about it, particularly as faith communities. So first, some housekeeping. Please feel free to add comments and questions in the chat throughout the session. We will also do our best to bring in questions during our discussion with the panelists, and there will also be time for questions and discussions after the panelist discussion. Interpretation is available in Spanish and French and Arabic. And if you haven't already found those channels, I think our interpreters are putting instructions into the chat as well. If you have questions and you would like to write in Spanish or French or Arabic, please feel free, as our interpreters will assist us with that as well. Thank you very much. Before we go into the presentations about misinformation and disinformation, let's take a moment to consider just information. Information itself is the basis on which all of our decisions are made, individually and collectively. The better the information, the more complete and relevant and accurate and understandable it is, the better our decisions can be. During this webinar, I expect we'll talk about information overload that makes picking out the right information difficult. But in WACC, we also talk about information poverty, that because of lack of access, language barriers, censorship, education, literacy, millions of people in every part of the world cannot access the news and the data they need to improve their lives and participate fully in society. Disinformation and misinformation add yet another problematic layer that seems to further divide society. But we have a stellar group of people today that will help us understand the issue and how it is seen in different parts of the world. But spoiler alert, there's no one answer that will solve all the problems. And most of us, well, probably all of us, still struggle to effectively respond in our own context. So this is an opportunity to learn from each other, to be inspired to do more, and identify areas where we need more action and tools. So first, to give us an overview of the matter, I'm very pleased to introduce Eliot Higgins, who is the founder and creative director of Bellingcat, an investigative journalism platform that is used by many media outlets around the world. Eliot is an award-winning journalist, and I discovered on an internet search was one of Politico Europe's top 28 most influential people in Europe in the disruptors category in 2021. So it sounds, Eliot, as if you were able to shake things up a bit. So please, Eliot, tell us a bit more about Bellingcat and about your work on disinformation and misinformation.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me today. It's really great to be able to speak to this audience about the work of Bellingcat. So Bellingcat, in a sense, is a reflection of many of the changes that have occurred in the way we consume information and media that's really been fueled since the introduction of the iPhone in 2007. This marked a significant shift in how we really interact with data. So we went from having computers and laptops and accessing information through there on the internet to having a device in our pocket that was constantly connected online, where we could find information, share information. The rise of social media platforms allowed us to share a vast amount of information about our own lives. And really from 2008 and 2000 to 2011, we saw the mass adoption of this technology across the world. And this really came to a head in 2011 with the Arab Spring, where suddenly this technology was being used by people in places like Libya and Syria and elsewhere to share information about what was happening. And that was when I came into this kind of work. So my experience before then was not in any professional field related to any of the work I do today. I worked in various businesses doing administration and finance work, but I was kind of someone who spent probably too much time on the internet, kind of debating and arguing about various events that were happening. And I spent a lot of time on the Guardian's Middle East Live blog discussing what was happening in Libya at the time in 2011. And I could see there was a lot of videos and photographs that were being shared online, but no one was paying any attention to them whatsoever because journalists generally found them difficult to verify. They had been burnt before because of various claims that had been made that turned out to be untrue, but they also didn't have the ability to verify things like videos from the conflict in Libya. And the people who were using them tended to be people who were more interested in building conspiracies around them, saying, you know, that person in the video is a CIA officer because he has an American accent. And I didn't find that very useful either. I just wanted to understand the conflict. And whilst I was kind of having these online discussions and arguments, I realized that by using satellite imagery available on places like Google Earth and Google Maps, you could do a process we now call geolocation, where you effectively do spot the difference between a video or photograph and satellite imagery of the same area. And that was kind of a very early discovery of this technique for verifying videos that really, as this field has grown from, you know, just me on the internet to news organizations, NGOs, places like the International Criminal Court using open source investigation, has become a root of the work that we do. Now, through the work that I did as I kind of grew my blog into a website and now into an NGO, we have encountered a vast amount of disinformation on a range of different topics. But often, if you actually look where this disinformation is coming from and the misinformation that also goes along with it, often the kind of forces behind it are very similar. It has basically social, technological, and psychological and emotional factors that are involved with the spread of disinformation and misinformation. Just before we continue, I'll just go over those two terms. So disinformation is false information that's deliberately created to fool people effectively. Misinformation is false information that's shared by people who genuinely believe it's true. And it's very important to understand the difference between the two of those. Really, since the 2016 election in the US and the focus that was paid to misinformation and disinformation around that campaign, there has been a perception that very often misinformation and disinformation comes from outside of our communities. It's something that, you know, Russia is doing to us, for example. And that was really the reaction to the 2016 election of Donald Trump, was to point the finger towards Russia and disinformation. But I think that was completely false, really. I mean, there were certainly attempts to create disinformation, but the real impact came from communities in the US, political communities, social communities, and the way people interacted with information online. So to break this down, I'll look at the kind of 6 main factors. The first 3 factors really fall under the category of psychological and emotional factors. So often people have real fears and legitimate questions about a whole range of different topics. So it could be, you know, we've encountered stuff about COVID vaccines, which obviously no surprise to anyone. Some people move into ideologies that are focused on things like the flat earth movement, for example. Some people, another factor is psychological needs during crisis as well. People want answers. They need to understand what's happening in the world. And sometimes it's easier to look stuff up online than to wait for real solid answers, especially when these questions are complicated and very difficult to answer themselves. And there's also a kind of a third factor, which is the community and emotional resonance you feel by finding like-minded people. And you can find a lot of these people on the internet, and really it covers every single topic under the sun. You then also have societal and cultural factors that are playing a big part of this. with the increasing distrust in mainstream media narratives and institutions, the range of sources we now have for information, we no longer have to rely on television news or newspapers. We can, especially young people, find someone on TikTok or another social media site that will tell them about things in a way they want to engage with. So there's a huge amount of choice. And with that choice, it allows you to kind of select the information that you're getting. If you're finding someone who's saying stuff you don't like, you just find someone who finds stuff that you do like. And that's a big issue. And that's especially true when it comes to around issues of personal experience and identity, which is the fifth factor, because this means that, in the case of, for example, COVID, one thing I discovered was a lot of the alternative health community were drawn into vaccine conspiracy theories because they already had experiences that meant they mistrust medical professionals. And sometimes this was personal medical experiences that went wrong, or that they had a loved one who fell ill and treatment didn't work on them when they were kind of overpromised things by doctors. So they lost that faith in the medical community and found alternative sources for medical advice online. And that's not to say that all of these people are saying that, Bill Gates is putting microchips in vaccines, but it means they were searching for an answer. Are vaccines safe? And that would put them on a path that exposed them to more and more extreme content because, and this is the sixth factor, we have this technological and media influence that comes from social media and algorithms. This means that, using the example of COVID again, if you search for, are COVID vaccines safe, when the vaccines were first announced, you'd get a lot of results from social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, websites about people who discuss the safety of vaccines, because this is a long-running issue with an established community around this. And a lot of these communities, if you imagine a kind of Venn diagram of communities, it isn't just one big community, it's different types of communities, because there might be people who are more focused on, say, like alternative health. They're thinking of things in terms of kind of essential oils and crystals, and not to criticize that, but that's just kind of a community that exists. There's the kind of alternative medicine community that are trying to find medical cures from different kinds of natural sources. So, these are people who might be using various types of mushroom powders and things like that. These are not extremists in any way. But what happens is you find these communities, and then the algorithm starts to suggest you content related to that community. And some of that content is going to be from people with slightly more extreme beliefs. So you might be looking at people who are discussing the safety of vaccines in terms of, and this is a debate in America among the community, the amount of vaccines you get at once, and saying there's too many additives and it's not safe. But then you get content from someone saying, actually, are they not only safe, but they don't really work. And then you start thinking, that's interesting, I'll click on it. And you basically get served the next layer of kind of views, which is actually not only are they not safe, but they are designed to make you sick because Big Pharma wants to make money from you. So you eventually have this kind of filtration system where a person starts with one opinion and they're exposed to a broader range of opinions from pre-established communities who have websites, blogs, experts. They might have someone with a doctor in their title. They may not explain that they're a doctor in economics, but they have a doctor, so they seem more credible. And you basically have a filtration process where you'll be filtered to the most extreme version of beliefs you are able to hold. And along with the algorithmically served information you're being shared, the community that's around you that you're engaging with, that will actually also have an effect of making you more open to possibly more extreme ideas. Now, that's not to say every single person goes from worrying about COVID vaccines to believing Bill Gates is putting microchips in them, but a percentage of those people do get to that point. And what that means is they've been drawn into a conspiracy community that often rejects mainstream thinking on any issue. And I've seen this on chemical weapon use in Syria, something I've dealt with a lot. The downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, which is something we've investigated, the flat earth movement, all kinds of ideologies online. You get this kind of almost algorithmic radicalization happening through social media. Now, there may be other processes involved, but often in the work that we're encountering, we are seeing this kind of filtration of belief. And the problem is, once you cross that line into the more extreme side of the beliefs, it's very difficult then to kind of come back to reality. Because what's often fundamental to these beliefs is a distrust in authority. And that could be the media, government, medical authorities, so on and so forth. And a belief that anything they say has to be a lie. And often when people have views that are that extreme, it's because they've had an extreme personal experience. I call it traumatic moral injury, where someone has experienced something that completely shifts their kind of the lens they see the world through. An example of this is the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where many people who were against the conflict in Iraq saw collusion between the media, and this is especially true in the UK and US, between the media and the government to build a case to go to war in Iraq that was based on effectively lies. And for some people, that put them in a kind of psychological space where they felt that they could no longer trust the government or the media when it came to similar topics. So when it came to the conflict in Syria, for example, they saw it purely through the lens of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And that meant anyone else who was saying, like we were at Bellingcat, Assad is using chemical weapons, those people knew that couldn't be true because that's what was said about Iraq, and therefore it must be a lie because we know that the West lies about this and the media lies about it. Then Bellingcat as an organization must also be part of that kind of conspiracy against the Syrian government to steal their oil or whatever it may be. And this becomes a real problem because once they reach that point, you cannot reach them with facts, because they have all the facts they need from the community around them. And these are not people who think I am involved in conspiracy theories, I am spreading disinformation. They are people who think they are finding the truth, and they are fighting against dark forces, the corrupt media and government, and that anyone who attacks them for that is part of this conspiracy against right-thinking people like they are. And this is why misinformation is so important, because these are not people who are spreading disinformation because they genuinely believe this stuff is true. Now, some people may create disinformation around this, and I've certainly seen this happen a lot with governments, for example, or online grifters who are just trying to make money from this. But often it's genuinely, people with genuine biases, the way they've been influenced by online communities and the communities around them, they actually exist in a kind of separate reality. So how do you reach these people? Effectively can't in many cases. If you don't have, if these people often are people who become separated from their families, they reject other communities who don't believe the same things they do because they see them as being foolish and misinformed and part of the problem that they're trying to fight against. So for Bellingcat, the work we're doing is more focused on education. And there are a lot of efforts around misinformation and disinformation to educate young people, how to identify it and counter that. But whilst those are noble efforts, I think that's kind of missing the point and the cause of this. It's addressing the symptoms of a far more fundamental issue we have with society at the moment. And that issue is one that can only be resolved by engaging people from a young age with the issues and not just saying, hey, you're all going to be fact checkers now, because no young person is going to go to school thinking, hey, I'm going to fact check a news article today. What you want to actually do is empower them with the investigative tools that, for example, use at Bellingcat with open source investigation, and show them how to investigate issues in their own areas, as well as understanding issues around algorithms, social media, artificial intelligence that impact their lives. Because the policy at the moment is thinking that because a 5-year-old can play a game on a tablet, that when they're 13 and they get their smartphones, they can navigate the complex online information landscape, which is absolute madness, really. So the work we're doing at Bellingcat at the moment is we've built a school curriculum. We're working in the UK with organisations who are involved with schools. We are training 200 teachers at the moment to deliver the pilot version of this. And our hope is eventually this will turn into something that is taught at schools. It will allow schools to build pop-up newsrooms that allow their students to investigate issues that impact them. They will be connected to a broader network of organizations who are working on these issues that would include NGOs and news organizations, both local and national, and really create a network of individuals, communities who are working together on fixing issues, rather than getting angry about the issue and finding like-minded people online who will nod in agreement and then finding other people online to shout at because they don't agree with the same things that they do, which at the moment seems to be the way we're going. And the problem at the moment we face is that when you think of this in terms of government, they are thinking in terms of regulation and how things can be shut down to stop the spread of misinformation. But when you're dealing with people who distrust the government, that is the number one way to make them distrust the government more rather than actually fixing the problem. So yeah, that's kind of the work of Bellingcat. I hope this sparks some interesting discussion. I'm looking to hear it from the rest of you. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Eliot, for that whirlwind discussion about an introduction to disinformation, misinformation. So yes, hang on there because I have a question. So, I mean, you highlighted some huge challenges of the causes of disinformation, that deliberate sharing of false information, and misinformation where people are honestly sharing it because they think that it's true, and it's running from people's fears, the ease of being able to access things online, the information that's out there, the major distrust there is in some of our institutions, and then the rabbit hole effect that you just continue to go down that point. So do you see now, as this open source fact checking organization, and you've highlighted the need for education, but do you see that fact checking has a role? I mean, and do you see it as a journalist role, or do you see churches or faith communities, individuals being able to take on something useful in terms of preparing truthful information?
Yes, fact checking does have a role, but the problem in the past has been, this is especially true after 2016, is that fact checking almost became the be all and end all of the solution of this problem. So we had lots of people getting government funding to set up websites with fact checks on that no one bothered reading. The real thing, what you need to do is create a community around issues who question things, who will investigate things themselves, rather than having a kind of top-down approach. Because the thing is, you have to act almost like white blood cells in the kind of body of the information system. You have to be able to react rapidly to the infections that come through misinformation and disinformation. We actually saw this with the conflict in Ukraine. So Bellingcat worked on the conflict in Ukraine since 2014 with the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17. And throughout that, we've built a community around us. And they're online communities, they're real world communities, but they are people who have engaged with open source investigation. And they are people who have learned from Bellingcat, basically us leading by example. And what this meant in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what we saw were attempts at disinformation, fake videos, misattributed images, stuff we've seen a lot before. But now we had an online community that immediately reacted to that. They debunked.
Sorry, Eliot, you're breaking up. Yeah, you're really breaking up. Oops, and maybe we've even lost you at this point. But with that sort of talk about a huge amount of information, with that information, let's also hear about more direct experiences on disinformation, the deliberate sharing of inaccurate information, and misinformation, sharing honest, what people honestly believe is true. And for this, I'd like to introduce 4 people who bring perspectives from different corners of the world. So first, I'd like to introduce Reverend Dr. Lesmore Ezekiel, who is the Director of Programs at the All Africa Conference of Churches, headquartered in Kenya. I'd also like to welcome the Professor Dr. Magali Cunha, who is a researcher on communication and religion at the Institute of Studies of Religion in Brazil. She's a journalist and also part of the Berea Project of Information and Fact-Checking. Von Giuseppe Balviar, who's a communicator with the Philippine Independent Church. Welcome. And Kathleen Kiefer, who is the National Vice Moderator of Presbyterian Women in the USA and chair of their Justice and Peace Committee. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. And Kathleen, I'm sorry, but I'm going to pick on you first, because Eliot referred to 2016 as a kind of starting point and that happened in the US in terms of the political climate. And maybe you could describe for people, your experience with disinformation and misinformation, because I think it's been surrounding you for some time.
Yes, it has. We are awash in disinformation and misinformation in the US. It started long before 2016, but I think in 2016 we realized that it was a serious problem in the United States. We've become very partisan and separated from each other. There's a lot of splinter groups that have taken this Christian nationalist idea, and that idea is that everybody in the United States has to be Christian or they have to leave. And it goes into a white supremacist, misogynistic, everybody needs to have a gun, and it's very, like, I would consider it off the rails as far as their thinking. Disinformation has been coming for quite a while from Fox News, and they use that term news very loosely. They are not a news program at all. They might have a little bit of news, but mostly it's commentary and opinion, and conspiracy theories. We have lots of conspiracy theories, and unfortunately, the people in the United States just eat those up. They really like those and spread them on social media. And nobody seems to want to fact check anything because they like it so well. So there's disinformation that the news outlets are giving. So besides Fox News, we have Breitbart, QAnon. You've heard of QAnon, I'm sure, and some others that are giving out disinformation, and that becomes misinformation when people share it. We have a group right now that started a couple years ago called Moms for Liberty, and this is a group mostly of women who are they're forwarding this agenda of banning books. And so there's so many books that are being taken off the shelf. And these are women who are running for school boards. They're in the local community. Each community has their own little group, and they're really taking over the little cities and the towns in the United States. And it's really very scary here. So we have the January 6th insurrection, which, some people believe that it was just, some tourists that got out of hand. And that's not what it was. And when you show videos of what happened and the people who were harmed during that insurrection, they say, well, those pictures they're made up. That's not the truth. So they're doctored videos.
Yeah. So it's part of when you were describing it, it makes it seem as if there are some people who just don't care if it's true or not, that it's almost an entertainment way to spread conspiracy.
Yes. And there's also the idea that if we say it loud enough and long enough, it'll be true.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that the people that want to spread the misinformation, they don't actually care if it's true. They just want other people to believe it.
Yes.
And we don't have a very good way to fact check things. Nor is there a desire for most people. They just want to believe it. So we have Snopes, which I go to quite frequently if I read something that doesn't make sense to me. I will fact check it. But a lot of people just want to believe what they hear, especially if they hear it on Fox News or Breitbart.
Yeah. Thank you for this introduction to a rather complex situation, I know, in the US in particular. Let me go to Vaughn, though, in another part of the world. Does what Kathleen share from her perspective, does that resonate a bit with your situation? How do you experience misinformation in the Philippines?
Well, we also experience misinformation, and similarly, because of it, you could see people being polarized, especially around politics in the Philippines. But also expanding on what has already been taken up about it coming from disinformation and misinformation coming from a long time ago. An example that I'm about to bring up is reminiscent of McCarthyism in the United States and efforts to witch hunt in history across the West. No, and this is what we call in the Philippines as red tagging. So in the Philippines, there is this tendency to look at social justice advocates, members of the media, and even church people who work in humanitarian fronts, in human rights defense. There's a tendency to call us terrorists or to call us rebels, state enemies, subversives, and a lot more, or to call us as fronts or recruiters. Personally, as a journalist, a lay and youth church worker, an educator, and an activist, it actually hits me not only as a Christian, but also as a member of all these other circles. One time we were hit as the youth sector of the Philippine Independent Church was only last July because they thought our logo seemed a little communist. Certain media people who were serially red tagging people and institutions in the past called on our highest bishop to stop our diocesan youth camps and called on state forces to step into our campsites and expose people as young as 13 years old to guns and to state forces in schools and in what were supposed to be safe spaces. There are two things that I think contribute to this to the prospering of such disinformation in the Philippines. One is the national policy, which has been the collapse of the negotiations between the Philippine government and the National Democratic Front of the Philippines that happened in 2017 and led to the creation in 2018 of a task force whose goal was to influence policies to sabotage peace processes, and in that line also engineer disinformation campaigns to ensure that there was a perception among the masses that such policies, such stoppage to peace processes was necessary. And troublingly, the current administration has no clear plans with regards to this agency. The second one is media. And if you look at the red tagging that has happened in the Philippines, there has been a multi-platform approach. And what do I mean when I say multi-platform? It's been online and offline. State forces and their supporters would tag churches and other individuals in seminars, in vandalisms, in streamers on the streets, co-opted media and through politicians, etc., to ensure that they would popularize the fact that their allegation that, for example, the Philippine Independent Church is actually communist. And then there would be what a researcher from the Philippines has called network information, where whenever they launch claims against us, there would be an added layer of semi-automation, which includes public relations companies, influencers, especially on social media, and troll farms. Through them, these arguments from red taggers and from these other purveyors of disinformation would be picked up and would be popularized on the airwaves and many other pockets to ensure that their agenda becomes the primary agenda in public fora. So um, it was Maria Ressa who said, our Nobel laureate, who said, disinformation is death by 1,000 cuts. And that has been happening to many churches, many individuals in the Philippines. Um, because of endless red tagging, a lot of us have been in trouble. A lot of us have been troubled. And a lot of us have faced endless judgment, vilification, harassment, and insecurity in our lives.
Yeah, that really highlights the very personal and institutional impact that disinformation, particularly in a deliberate political media environment, can have.
Yes.
And that it's so much more easier to launch an attack than it is to defend against it. And especially so when you are in the forefront of trying to work for peace and justice, and you're doing something that's a bit controversial, then to be, as you put it, red tagged, immediately makes you
a victim. A lot of times, yes, especially because they have deeper pockets compared to us as churches, as social activists, as members of opposition in the Philippines. We don't have as much the resources to even equate to what they can do as users of networks of disinformation in the Philippines.
So you are already very much on the back foot, so we have to so we'll come back to more examples perhaps of things that you have tried to do, but now I'd like to move to Lesmore, and also put you on the spot because of your title with the All Africa Conference of Churches. We're talking not just of one country perhaps, but an entire continent. Lesmore, what's been your experience with disinformation, misinformation? Is there a specific example or that you can point to?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to friends joining from different parts of the world. Sarah, I was inspired by the opening address of Eliot, and he made specific references even to the issues relating to COVID-19. We are faced with, but let me be quick to disclaim that I'm not a journalist, but of course the social media platform has made us all journalists, which things are just posted, shared, and all of that without censorship. So this is the major drive of disinformation, and of course it provided space for misinformation to be circulated everywhere. And this has been a challenge for us, particularly in the continent of Africa. When I was thinking, and I read the concept notes here, I am confronted with the question of what is the truth, and who defines and determines what truth is, especially in a world that is equally driven by this notion of consumerism, where people just think that we can just consume whatever that is produced somewhere else, particularly for our own people in Africa. For example, when COVID struck, of course, there was lockdown. Myself, I was on assignment to Cameroon. I was locked down in Cameroon, but somehow found my way back to Kenya. And we went on, creating awareness and calling member churches to be more intentional in safeguarding the vicinity, conveying appropriate information to members and all of that, and avoid this idea of the eschaton, or we're looking at the end of age, that all of these things were going to happen and the end of age has come. We know how misleading theologies have been spread across. These were the challenge. And so we convened webinars, virtual engagements. I mean, one of it was to hold a conference where we tagged it Faith and Science in Conversation, in order to dispel some of those misleading information and toxic. In fact, they are toxic information that were being spread around. And so in the course of that, we prayed and we asked for God's divine intervention as people of faith. And so not long, the vaccine was discovered. And so when the vaccine was said, oh, vaccine has been provided, oh my goodness. Another sophisticated form of conspiracy theories came up about the vaccine. Of course, like Eliot mentioned, whether Bill Gates have inserted some chips in it, and so therefore it is the mark of the beast that is being pumped into people's body. And all of that, and you can imagine the pious Christians around Africa and all of that, and so it became a challenge to also inform people that, look, the vaccine is safe. Okay, so some raised the question that, oh, how is it that a vaccine can be discovered within the shortest possible time when we had HIV and AIDS, and vaccine was never discovered? So all of this comparison comes in, and people are faced with the question of what is the truth about this vaccine? And so we try as much as possible, because some of this information are coming from the West, from the global North. And, you know, there's this erroneous thinking that whatever that comes from the global North, that comes from America, is sacrosanct, is something that has been verified and it is acceptable. But we tell people, no, there are conspiracy theories in the global North who would package distorted information, toxic information, package them and export them to the continent of Africa, and people will freely consume. And so those are the challenges that we were confronted with, to say, how then do we deal? How then do we deal with such distorted information, toxic, life-suffocating information that is going around, and all of that? So this has been our experience, and we said, okay, what do we do? So from AACC, we convened another webinar just to say, okay, how can we theologically respond to all of this? So we came up with a 10-point theological thesis with regards to responding to COVID-19, you know, and also invited church leaders from across the continent. Please go, take the vaccine, take a photo and post it and say, look, I am here. I remember when I took mine and I posted it on the social media, some people sent me, say, oh, so you have limited days to live. You're going to die soon, okay? So those are because of the disinformation, how they are being packaged in such a way that, I mean, like Kathleen mentioned, it is often a challenge to spend time to do a background check, to investigate the veracity of such information before it is even circulated, because it is moved from one WhatsApp to another. I will receive a WhatsApp from a friend in Philippines or in India, and someone from Cameroon is sending the same WhatsApp message to me. You can imagine how fast such distorted information are sent, and many people have lost their lives as a result of this disinformation and how it is being circulated, misleading and destroying men. Let me stop at that now, Sarah. Otherwise, I will continue with my sermon.
Yes, I mean, it's fascinating because you inferred, I think, let me just check something, because you said how people were calling the vaccine a mark of the beast. So were churches part of, I mean, and then you had a theological response. So did you feel churches were part of or even leading that kind of conspiracy thing about COVID in the first place?
Absolutely, Sarah. I mean, I remember once mentioning, maybe I mentioned it also to you, that we are faced with church merchants who call themselves prophets, apostles, preachers, and all of that. Church merchants, they're business. They're out there for business, and they want to make money from miracles and fake miracles, lies, and all of that. And so those were the spreaders, the super spreaders of saying that, look, in this vaccine, there is the chip, which of course is the mark of the beast. And so the moment it is pumped into you, you cease to be a candidate of God's kingdom. And the message went through. And those were the things that we tried to address in the 10 theological theses, to say, look, can we see science also as a gift from God if we will treat all other gifts, including the sun, the moon, the air, and all of those things as gifts? Science equally should be seen, treated as a gift. We pray to God for intervention, and God intervened through science by providing the vaccines. So these were the issues that we addressed. However, not to say that everything that science present to us, we just take it sacrosanct and say it is holy, and thus says the Lord, and all of those things. So we were confronted with this, but we are able to say, look, do not listen to those merchants of the church merchants who are telling you lies about the vaccine. And many embraced it, but I tell you still today, there are many, many preachers, particularly charismatic preachers, who have refused and not accepted to be vaccinated.
Yeah. That really gets at the heart of the issues that are facing us also as faith communities. What is our motivation in sharing the information? Magali, this is part of your research, but also and also then part of your efforts in terms of fact-checking and information. Could you share a little bit more about how you got involved in that and what you're finding?
Thank you, Sarah. And it's good to be here. Greetings from Brazil to all of you. It's an old question in Brazil. I could bring examples from military dictatorship in the 60s, 70s. However, I would like to point a paradigm. Since 2018, Brazil has been inundated with disinformation that fueled the electoral campaign of the far right that led Jair Bolsonaro to the presidency of Brazil. The situation became so severe that in the first year of Bolsonaro's government, an inquiry was launched in the Supreme Federal Court. The inquiry is still ongoing, investigating digital attacks that threaten democracy and public discourse, and the use of fake profiles with irregular financing to influence the results of the 2018 elections and also last year's elections, the 2022 elections. The investigation has revealed that during Bolsonaro's 4 years in power, a machinery for the production and dissemination of false content was established to interfere in matters of public interest. There is an existence of an office within the federal government dedicated to producing disinformation of political nature. And investigation indicates, listen, that there were 10 publications with false content per hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from the federal government to influence public debate. And we will talk more about that later, with the support given by church leaders and Christian followers aligned with ultra-conservatism of this Bolsonaro's government. The segmented content, privileged religious approaches. This is a very serious point to our reflection. And the most serious experience occurred during COVID-19 pandemic, already mentioned in this webinar, we are talking about it a lot, which was the target of lies questioning social distance measures, promoting preventive and curative treatments, accusing China and the World Health Organization of communist control, and opposing the vaccination campaign, as already mentioned here, surprisingly, even with content coming from the national government. There was also circulation of homemade recipes and miraculous medications against COVID. Thousands of people died at that time for believing in such contents. Many linked to churches, and people continue to die due to the lingering effects of the pandemic. Now, this ecosystem of disinformation is still on in opposition to the new government, to Lula's government that took over last January. Lots of challenges.
Yes, lots of challenges. And this also links, what you're presenting is also linked to a comment that was in the Q&A. And I encourage people to use the Q&A. There are a couple of questions we'll come to, but people can continue to post things there that really talked about the church as part of the problem. And this comment is also saying the church is one of the few institutions that have some sort of entrance in indigenous communities. So they often are the only source of information that people get. So Magali, in your experience, how can the church work in its own circles to try to combat that misinformation or disinformation?
Yes, research has shown that religious environments are highly vulnerable to the circulation of disinformation. Eliot has already mentioned this issue of belief. This can be explained by sentiments cultivated in this physical and digital spaces related to belief and trust. Christians are not only prone to assimilate false content and ideas circulating on the internet that align with their beliefs, but they also value what reaches their religious group more. The social media accounts of church groups and their leaders are accredited as sources of truth because they are seen as channels of trustworthy spaces and individuals associated with the cultivation of faith. Religious individuals who receive such content tend to propagate it, a kind of evangelization, spreading these news and ideas to convert others to the same purpose. So these notions help to explain how these homemade recipes and miraculous medications for the cure and prevention of diseases, more recently for COVID-19, but not only, have been widely propagated in these religious environments. So we have this serious ecosystem of disinformation that have religions, not only Christians, but religions in general, because of the issue of belief that is a target, a strategy in this ecosystem of spreading this contents.
Let me bring all of the panelists in for a little bit of a conversation discussion with some of the questions that are coming up. And it's not just on COVID. Do you see other issues that are targets for misinformation? Even general issues, and are the churches also equally implicated in some of that? I mean, Vaughn, you talked about just the communist, the political outline, but is it attached to other major issues?
One thing that comes out, pops out from my head right now is HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus. In the Philippines, sex talk is conservative talk. It's not something you talk about for a lot of Christians here. And so a lot of misconception occurs in the Philippines related to sexually transmitted diseases, and among them, human immunodeficiency virus, because we don't talk about sex, and we don't talk about the LGBTIQ plus community as much. So here in the Philippines, you have this thinking that you can get HIV from a banana that's infected, or from a mosquito, or from kissing a gay person, because the fact is much of the transmission happens among men having sex with men. Um, what we try to do uh, with the National Council of Churches in the Philippines and some churches who are members of NCCP is we try to engage these people with correct information on human immunodeficiency virus, and we try to, although it has been very, very tough, because this puts us against evangelicals and the Roman Catholic Church, which are a vast, vast majority of the Philippine population. Um, we try to influence policies on sexuality. We try to ensure that uh, churches also become safe spaces to talk about HIV, about sex, about the several taboos that have caused stigma, social ills in the Philippines. So that's one thing I can think about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I come in,
Yes,
Sarah?
there's more. Yep.
There are quite a number of issues that have been perpetuated because of disinformation. But one that comes quickly to mind is even the issue of climate change. Okay, the apocalyptic thinking that it has been packaged to and exported for people to feel that no matter what you do, put in place whatever resilient mechanism, climate change will happen. We have seen that even perpetrated during the Trumpism campaign, where say, no, this is a Chinese hoax, nothing about climate change. And it was theologically packaged by these church merchants, by these misleading theologians, and exported to the extent that people might just relax and saying God at some point will intervene in God's way, not necessarily doing anything in terms of adaptation or mitigation. And so this has caused a lot of disasters, even in many communities in the continent of Africa. And that is why even as AACC, we have prioritized the issue of creation care as very critical, that it is our collective responsibility, and because of human greed and corruption, that the Mother Earth has been plundered, raped, and destroyed. And today we are suffering the devastating consequences of our action. And so therefore, since we are part of the problem, we have to be part of the solution, relying on God's wisdom also on how we can equally engage with the indigenous communities who would always advocate for nature-based solution, and with our own commitment as a people. So disinformation around climate change have hit us badly in the name of religion. And some churches today, I mean, we had a consultation with religious leaders in Nairobi at our facility. And I asked a simple question. The question was, in the last 12 months, how many of you that are seated here, numbering almost 70, have preached about climate change during church worship? I must tell you, none of the religious leaders gathered there raised their hands. 12 months ago. So you can see that it is about preparing people for paradise somewhere else, but not caring about what happens in this paradise that we are in. So this is as a result of this information that has been well packaged, exported, and being consumed. And of course, the issue of human sexuality, issues of politics, seen as evil, and all of those things. These are all disinformation that we are confronted with.
Yeah, Kathleen, did you want to add any other aspect on the issues that we're confronting?
Sure. I'd like to address in the way that the Presbyterian Church USA handles some of these things in our own quiet way of fighting things like discrimination and discrimination against several groups and the LGBTQIA, Black individuals, immigrants, and all of those things. We have Creation Care, a Department of Creation Care, and many congregations throughout the country are Creation Care congregations. So they follow certain protocols, maybe have solar energy instead of using the utilities available, composting in their own small way. And each congregation, it's up to each congregation to do that. And we have developed several years ago what we call Matthew 25 initiative. And so has 3 prongs. It's congregational vitality, dismantling structural racism, and eliminating systemic poverty. And so those things combat those areas that are popular in the Christian nationalist group, because they're all about discriminating and not believing in climate change and not wanting LGBTQIA people in their congregations. So I think that's the way Presbyterians do that. We have a lot of adult education curriculums that follow those that teach to the truth about certain areas. The problem is getting those congregations involved, because it's up to them. So, and getting that communication out to the churches.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Eliot and get your perspective on how. So when we're seeing the ease with which churches and church leaders can share disinformation, which would happen in other factors, and then to combat it takes longer, but it also seems to be more complex, because the misinformation can be very black and white, for instance, and be easily shared. Disinformation, to combat them, is a longer process. Do you have any kind of advice, as you're listening to this, about what churches or church leaders could do?
Yeah, I think so often the solution focuses on the idea of addressing the piece of that disinformation directly. And while there is value to that, again, as I was saying earlier, that kind of misses the fundamental issues that are at play here. And it is a complicated issue, because you're dealing with different kinds of communities, different groups. When people pass a certain threshold, it's very difficult to reach those people. So really what we have to be looking at is, how do we get to those people before they get drawn into this process of effectively radicalization on any topic under the sun? I think we have to understand the scope of this issue as well, because when we're working on issues, it's very easy just to think of terms of disinformation as affecting one kind of group. But really, you could say there's 7 kind of main groups that produce and are affected by disinformation and misinformation. So you're looking at, first of all, political groups, and that could be focused on national politics, local politics, a particular political figure, sometimes even media figures who have an impact on politics. It can be focused on conflict, for example, the work we've done on Syria and what we've had to face there. Another example are the health networks. So as I said before, the alternative health people who they become, spreaders of misinformation. There are people who are just full-on conspiracy theorists and believe in the New World Order and false flag conspiracy theories. There's the financial conspiracy theory and misinformation circles, which are often focused on, for example, one person we've been looking into has been selling Zimbabwean dollars when they were, 500 trillion on a single note, saying that these notes will suddenly become valuable again and everyone will be incredibly rich, which is just something he's made up. Historical revisionism, so that could be people who are, for example, his Holocaust deniers, technology misinformation groups, so 5G conspiracy theories and things around that, and then societal and cultural misinformation groups that can focus on immigration, race relations, religion, gender issues. Now, often you see an interaction between those different groups as well. And what I've been dealing with countering disinformation is that most of the policymakers and the people who are in a position to make a decision about this don't understand that at all, because generally they've experienced in one or two terms misinformation. Often it's health stuff because of COVID, and then it's political misinformation, but they barely think about the other stuff. And really that is all part of one system. It's not 7 separate groups. It's fundamentally the causes of that are often the same. And fundamentally, we need to actually address the issues as one large issue that is affecting society and our culture, not as something that is just affecting one kind of people or one group of people. But that is very difficult, because what we're talking about there is a significant kind of cultural shift in the way we educate people and what the goal of education is. That's why with the work we're doing at Bellingcat, we're not just teaching young people how to have media literacy and use the internet, but we want them to become investigators themselves, because what we've observed, certainly in the UK and elsewhere in the West, that there's an increasing disengagement from politics, the media, civil society, because people don't feel they have any power in there, and it's pointless to even try. But what we're trying to show people is that, yes, you can have an impact, you can have power there, you can actually be part of journalism and investigation and impact politics. Because if people don't feel like that, they look for that source of empowerment online by finding these groups that reinforce their beliefs and really gives them a false sense of empowerment by just upsetting the other community that they don't like. And it's not a solution. It just reinforces the problems that we're facing today. So very deeply, we need an educational approach. And that isn't just about going into schools and having young people learn this, but it's engaging with communities like yours and sharing these ideas and discussing it and looking for opportunities where we can help out and kind of build these ideas of kind of collaborative, investigative networks looking at issues. Because I think that kind of community-led approach is extremely important to the solutions that we're looking for.
Yeah, so it's really looking at not just countering the fact, but looking at why. Why did this come? Why is this being developed? And trying to address in the larger picture that why. Before I move off from you, Eliot, though, as a journalist, though, how do you teach? And this relates to one of the questions that's in the chat, which is, can you have facts on both sides of a story? How do, as a journalist, can you have both saying the same, have stories with the different sides of the same coin?
Well, I mean, with facts, in terms of open source investigation, we often are dealing with a physical reality of a situation. So, for example, if there's an airstrike in Syria or a chemical weapons attack or something like that, what we're dealing with is actually a physical reality. We aren't dealing with opinions. We may have different perspectives. You might have a witness who is, has seen something and it may contradict what another witness says, but you're triangulating the information around that. You're looking at satellite imagery, photographs, videos, trying to establish what happened there. Now, that's not always possible because these events are often complicated. But on the other side, you have, events that are kind of less based in the reality of the world. It's like someone said this thing, or there's an interview out there that's been clipped in a very specific way. So what you aren't really dealing with there is facts. You're dealing with kind of selective interpretation of information, which can fall under the category of malinformation. So bad information that is shared is true, but it's shared to actually cause harm to a position or a person or, a community. So yeah, I'm very much a believer in kind of the physical reality and building our opinions and facts based off that. But when you move into ideas of opinion and kind of more complex issues, it's kind of how do you establish that to convince everyone who's involved of what that reality is.
And so when we talk about facts, we also talk about, I think we raise the question about truth. You know, what is truth? We're in the business as church communities of truth. And we also talk about trust. So with misinformation being, you know, largely, as Eliot and a number of other of you also highlighted, that there's a lack of trust in institutions that might provide solid information, combat some of that misinformation. Where is the trust factor in our contexts? How can we maximize trust? And Lesmore, I'm going to talk to you first, because you also talked about, you know, these are the church merchants who are doing the misinformation, but they also obviously have a level of trust. Are there other institutions which are trustworthy in your context?
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the question of trust. Recently, a survey was conducted in Kenya, a trust index survey. And the simple question is, which of these institutions do you trust more? And of course, religious institution, the police, the judiciary, the whatever, and all of those. And actually, the church came top. So we are confronted with the question of how do we safeguard this trust? And this is not just only in Kenya, but in a number of countries, that religious communities, particularly the church, the mosques, and all of that, have a high level of trust by the citizenry. And that, again, exposes religious communities to so many disinformation, to the point that if it is circulated, you know, it is easily consumed. It's like, oh, the Messiah have spoken. And so now our task is, how do we ensure that these religious leaders who are at the moment enjoying some level of trust will safeguard it to ensure that appropriate, right, accurate information are circulated? But I tell you, as long as the social media platform is there and checked and censored, we are confronted with a challenge. If it is a mainstream media, it is understandable. That is controlled. The editor will say, no, this cannot go out, even though we know about Fox News that is there. And of course, it is Fox and fake and all of those things. This we know. But again, there's some level of checks and balance. There's some level of control and censorship. But that is not the case with the social media platform. And gradually, it is impacting massively on the trust. And so I see some level of trust deficit that is, it's happening among even the religious communities, because here is a church martyr telling you that this is a miracle that will happen. And here is a religious leader that is very honest and saying, no. Go to the hospital, go and get vaccinated. Believe that climate change is there and we have a responsibility to reverse the devastation of this climate change and all of that. And so they are confronted with the question of who is saying the truth. But I tell you, a number of people do know that from the mainstream churches, the mainline churches, there's a level of trust and belief in them. But the church merchants are there. And I tell you, like Vaun mentioned earlier, their pockets are deep. They are deeply connected, even connected to big mega churches in the US. Kathleen, they are there. They finance them. They support them to perpetuate and sustain this information that is toxic. But like I said, we are making every effort to ensure that this trust level that people have on the religious communities are safeguarded, but it is not an easy task at all. As long as the social media platforms and there and allow people to be journalists, everyone to be a journalist, to post anything, then we are confronted with the challenge. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Les Morvan. You're nodding and raised your hand.
Yeah, I think we also have to check on how we came about the idea that we are trusted. Because sometimes, these surveys are in-house or they're partisan in nature. A lot of the surveys that we use in elections, for example, say that this person is the top candidate, but in fact, this person actually hired the house that did the survey, right? So it's also important, and I think Eliot would agree, that we try to look at how we came up with the trust issue, with the numbers for trust. What questions were asked? Are these questions quality questions, or even in the Philippines, or in the rest of Asia? Are they saying they trust us because we don't speak, because they're comfortable with us? Or do they trust us really because whatever we say, they will get behind, right? Because some people would say they trust you only because they're comfortable with your opinions. As churches, because the population might tend to be conservative, and our churches are conservative like them, therefore they trust us instead of the media, which would be in most places anti would be framed as anti-government, for example. And then I think we also have to look at the statistics and be worried, about not about the rankings of who is the most trusted, but where the drops are. Because in the end, I think the church should not be the only source that they trust. They should also trust principled media. They should trust field experts, especially these two. Um, if there is a huge drop in trust among media and scientists, experts in fields that matter, then we should also be worried about why that drop is happening. Not only, celebrating that the church is number one, right? So I think these are some points of discussion that we should um, also try to analyze when we talk about trust. What is the quality of this trust? And whether or not we should be proud that we are number one, or whether we should be seeing each other pitted against one another in a world where the church doesn't really know what to say about science and the experts do. The church doesn't really know much about politics, and the media people do. So these conversations, I think, should also be had.
Yes, that trust within the faith community is a very mixed bag, and you have to deal with the reality that in that context. Kathleen, how do you feel about that? Are there institutions and a sense that the church is trusted in the U.S.?
I think that trust is capricious. So, like a person who is in a Christian nationalist, evangelical, very conservative church will trust what that church teaches. But they would come to my church and say, "Oh no, this can't be." Because we're open and accepting and we're very inclusive. And so it's almost like the disinformation and misinformation. People will trust where they're comfortable and what they believe, but if they're subjected to another church, another set of information, they're not going to trust that. Whereas if I went to their church, I wouldn't trust them either. So it's difficult to say that where that trust is.
Yeah.
We can't even trust in what Jesus says. I heard a comment that a pastor was speaking about the Beatitudes, and one of his parishioners came up to him after church, and he said, "You can't teach about that. That's not good. You shouldn't teach about that." And the pastor said, "Well, why?" And he goes, "Well, that's that's really not, that's not good information. Well, it's what Jesus said, the pastor replied. And the man said, well, you know, we have to move beyond Jesus. He was a very weak person. What?
Yeah, where do you go from there?
I know, right?
I mean, one of the first questions that came up on the Q&A, which I think we're just addressing throughout, was if someone keeps calling all unpleasant facts fake news, how can one get them to see the difference between facts and disinformation? You know, and I think what we're all pointing out from Eliot's presentation onwards is that, well, you know, you can't reach them sometimes. So, you know, Magali, I'm going to go back to you and just as a last round, a quick round. If it's possible for everybody to think about what's one thing either that the church can do or that it should do if it was properly equipped to address misinformation. Can I put you on the spot, Magali?
Yes, it's a very good conversation. I'm learning a lot with you, and I'd like to come back with an element that Eliot brought, that is education. And I bring together prophetic denunciation. When we talk about church, and we talk about theology, when we talk about Christian positions, and education and prophetic denunciation have to come together. Educational campaigns. I'm involved with a project, the Berea project. We do fact checking, but we also work in educational initiatives. And we have done lots of experiences in Brazil with ecumenical organizations and churches. For example, with a set of social media cards that these groups have published, featuring the main lies that circulate in Christian environments and prevent attitudes. So we show the lies, and we call lies because this is the popular language that church people and ordinary people have in their daily lives. And we show these lies that circulate, and we show how to prevent attitudes against these lies, how to distrust. So reversing what we were talking before, to have a rather distrust, how people can feel they are used as traffickers of false content. People have to be challenged this way, that they are used as traffickers of false content. And this language, the language used in educational elements and initiatives is very important. To use the language people use in their daily lives, with language they identify. And this is very important. I would highlight these points.
That's fantastic. So Vaughn, maybe I can move to you. What's one thing that you think that churches should or could do?
Can I say three things instead? No, but just quickly. The first thing is the National Council of Churches partnered in 2022 with Rappler. This is the media agency of Maria Ressa, the Nobel laureate, and many other civil society groups to create Facts First PH. It's a coalition that does fact-checking, media and information literacy, monitoring of fake news on social media, ensuring that these are fed to the media and that the media release the information to fact-check them. It also ensures monitoring of behaviors. So I think as churches, we should also try to tap into other resources, because some of our church people are in the media, like me and Magali, we're in the media. Some of our people are scientists. Some of our people can have other abilities and networks in other areas of expertise that we can actually use in bigger coalitions. One of the big complaints among media in terms of fact checking is that there's just so much to fact check, we can't keep up. And perhaps if there are coalitions of people and organizations, we hopefully can be able to keep up. And two is set policy targets. I think it's important that everywhere we set policy targets for our governments and for these multinational social media entities. What do we want them to change? So we can clearly give them our asks and make sure that if these asks are not given, then our advocacy has failed. What does the government do about red tagging in the Philippines? What does Facebook do about information that is false being propagated on Facebook, on TikTok, right? And then the third thing is, I think it's important that we continue this conversation because this is a conversation where we can compare notes on theology and diaconia in terms of disinformation, information disorder. And second, it's one way to express our solidarity with one another and to educate one another about where we are connected, about what challenges we can cooperate on. But I do hope that we also listen to other, like, there are a lot of voices that we can listen to. It would be a failure on my part if I don't point out that young people should also be invited to the conversations, that they should also be heard because they know Facebook. We know Facebook, we know TikTok. And also, we also have to listen to people who who are more vulnerable, such as those with low media and information literacy. Some studies show that the older you get, the more susceptible you are to fake news. So we also have to listen to these groups in conversations that are richer, that are more varied, that bring in more expertise, more experiences from the ground.
Yeah, very comprehensive one. Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left. Still want to get in a few last comments. Kathleen, what do you think that the church could or should do?
Speaking for the PCUSA, I would like to see a curriculum that's for all ages, that addresses what fake news is, how to recognize it, and how to investigate it to see where it is, where it's come from, and what the truth of it is. And I think if people know that, then they're more likely to have a way to look at the news that they're getting from Facebook, which, is not your very best place to get news, or Fox News, and sometimes CNN, and certainly not President Trump. So I think that would be, because that's the way Presbyterians work. We work with adult education really well. And I think a curriculum that involves that would be really super.
Great, very concrete. Lesmore.
Sadly, time is not on our side, but all I would say is the churches, and what we're encouraging the churches in the continent is form what we call community of meaning, because all of these experts' competencies are within the church. How are we using them to fact check and all of those things? So use them, form them. They are assets, they are resources to the churches in Africa. And if we're able to do that, to some extent, we can counter disinformation as they spread across. Thank you.
Thank you. Eliot, I'm going to turn to you for maybe a little story of hope, because I think certainly the education that you raised has also been highlighted. Have you seen a place in the education that you've conducted in the schools where it really has made a difference?
Well, one thing that I found really a great inspiration for the work we're now doing in schools is the work of the Student View. So it's a small NGO in the UK they go into schools and they teach young people how to do basic investigation skills. And often they're working in deprived areas where students often don't have many opportunities. They have a bad relationship with the police and so on and so forth. There was one example in Bradford that really stood out to me because the young people in that school, there were always high-speed police chases on the streets they lived in, and they couldn't understand why. It seems to happen a lot. It was frightening. Young mothers would be frightened with their children and the cars sped by. And they were told you could do a freedom of information request. And this is something they had never heard of before. They didn't understand the concept of it, and they were amazed that you could ask the police for information and the police had to give you that information. And for them, it was a shift in the power dynamic that they were used to because they felt they had no power whatsoever. So they asked for this request and they got the information back, and it revealed that in Bradford there was an extraordinary high number of high-speed police chases by the police, and this became a local news story. It became a national news story, and for those young people, they had basically a chance for empowerment. Might seem a small thing, in the context of the work of Bellingcat. We work on chemical weapons attacks and all terrible things, but what impacts someone as an individual like that, I think, is very, very important. And it's something that's really worth building on and pursuing, because that's just one school in one city. But if we have that happening in every school, in every town, city, and village, then that will have a huge, huge impact, not just in terms of accountability, but re-engaging young people with civil society. And I think as a network of churches, you have a massive, massive opportunity to be involved with something like that. So I really hope that this conversation will create more interactions for opportunities for those kind of interactions.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists and for this very rich conversation today. And as we said, the conversation will continue. Our interest to keep the community connections and build community, and to reaffirm the power of information, good information, solid information, so that people can make the right decisions for their lives and for their society. I think that is so important. So thank you for being part of this conversation today. And as we said, the conversation will continue. We do intend to have a follow-up webinar sometime early next year. That will look more at actions and tools. We will take what has been shared here and collect more resources and be able to build on this so that really our churches, our faith communities can be places where people can get answers, get trustful information, and work to promote right relationships within their communities. So thank you all. Thank you very much. And thank you to our participants who are asking questions.